welcome. It has been a bit of a shuffle to get everything ready, but finally we can give the second presentation of Stewart McPherson about the discovery of carnivorous plants. Stewart?
Thanks. So thanks so much for everyone coming. Just to give a bit of an overview, this is a story about how the plants that we know to carnivorous today were actually discovered. There's this incredible chapter in natural history that it really hasn't been documented at all in much past literature, or many people aren't even aware of it. But the discovery of the plants that we all love and care about literally turned the tables of the natural world and completely reinvented the concept of a plant. And really, that's what this presentation is really about. So basically, the sources and information, by the way, if anyone wants the specific references of the different quotes and the material that I provided, I haven't provided the sources and quotes in this presentation, but they're all in my books, Carnivorous Plants and the Habitats. Okay, so the process of discovering carnivorous plants didn't happen overnight. No single botanist or naturalist came ahead and said, this plant's catch and kill insects. That's just simply how it didn't work like that. Rather, it was a process that evolved over centuries. It took literally, since they were found to since they were approved, 800 years for naturalists and botanists to actually realize that plants, and prove that plants and animals interact in very complex ways, and that certain plants actually kill and digest animals as prey. So basically, it involved input from hundreds of different botanists, but it was obviously, it sort of came together and was basically crystallized through the work of Charles Darwin, as we're going to see. We have evidence that people have known about carnivorous plants dating back to at least the 12th century, particularly here in Europe, for obvious reasons, and different historical sources that exist here in Europe. Basically, by far the best written references stretch back here. And we've got references going back at least to the 12th century with Drosera, over 900 years, dating back, referring to this plant as the sun plant, by the Italian doctor Platarius, or however you pronounce it. Basically, after that, those first references, the different ideas and concepts of the plants evolved radically over the coming centuries. In the 13th century, the plants had completely different names, for example. As you'll notice back then, it was called herba sol, or the sun plant. And obviously, that's the origin of the names sundew and drosera. But it had various different names over the centuries, and at least in the 13th century, it was known as the youthwort. These early observations all basically looked at different properties of the plants. Carnivorous plants really are quite striking for a number of reasons. They all have unique leaf structures that differ from most other plant species. And with the sundews, these early naturalists, these very early observers, actually identified that the plants have these droplets of glue that continually stay on the plant's leaves. And they noticed that even in the hottest, sunniest weather, these mysterious droplets of glue were always present. And that gave rise to the very earnest belief in these early sources that they had magical or mystical properties. For example, Slack actually records that pinguicula in Elizabethan times were actually thought to protect cattle from elf arrows and humans from the magic and mischief of witches and fairies. And obviously you've got to remember this is in a completely different mindset. We're talking, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries where there simply wasn't a systematic classification of plants. There weren't even formal plant names at this point. So although this might sound ridiculous today, the uses of these plants, the known uses of these plants simply hadn't been documented. So different cultures and traditions across Europe had invented these different mystical properties and uses. And I guess they just came into folklore. And as I say, these plants can be incredibly striking, and it's really not difficult to see how some of these uses might have come into play. Obviously, seeing Drosera in the wild for the first time, you see these spectacular species glowing, even though this isn't a European species. This is Drosera alba from South America. Nevertheless, it's very easy to... Sorry? In South Africa. It's very easy to imagine, basically why these magical properties were believed and earnestly applied in many different ways. And obviously the important point here to remember is that we're really relying on written records. The likelihood is that these uses and beliefs go way back, way back before the 12th century, but just simply there's no evidence to prove or validate that. Unfortunately, for pretty much all other carnivorous plant genera, we don't really have any written records dating back before the 18th century. Unfortunately, yeah, they just simply weren't recorded. But from the 15th, 16th, 17th century onwards, as Europeans really began to started to explore and travel in colonial times, that process started to change, and the early European naturalists really brought back reports and documented some of these traditional uses. From the 14th and 15th centuries, the rationale really started to change. We're starting to see, the rudimentary basis of education, obviously Oxford, Cambridge in England, and Tübingen in Germany, and a number of other academic institutions were actually starting to really obviously take hold across Europe. And from the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the documented uses and beliefs of the plants dramatically change. It's no longer magical, it's no longer mystical, it's practical, it's medicinal, it has a physical value that these people started to collect these plants. Particularly with Drosera, these uses, were medicinal. Drosera have a history stretching back to the 14th century of being used to cure very large numbers of different medical ailments, including stomach upsets and antiseptic properties. Many of these uses are very much subject to belief, and probably remnants of those mystical and magical beliefs were persisting on into these uses. But nevertheless, other ones had very practical uses. Nepenthes, for example, continue still to this day to be used for cooking rice in pots. I've seen a number of Nepenthes species being used to cook rice across Indochina, across Peninsula Malaysia, Borneo, Sumatra, New Guinea, and that use very much continues to this day. A huge number of Nepenthes species have been involved in making rope and different forms of twine, and again, that continues still. And especially medicine. Nepenthes have a very unique, very, very special property, that the water inside their unopened pitchers has this very special property of being not only sterile, but of fresh water, which you might think it's unlikely, but actually in tropical environments, that's pretty rare. You don't really get a lot of standing water in many Nepenthes habitats, and you also don't get any sterile water. So if you look in my books, there's basically a number of records stretching back, again, at least to the 17th century, recording how these different fluids in the pitchers were used actually for treating eye sores. Down near Mount Trasmadi, for example, a number of sources have documented that traditional uses include eye washes for sore eyes and infections. And what's really interesting is you see exactly the same uses, practical uses, being repeated and duplicated again and again in different parts of the world. And in particular with Nepenthes, this is very interesting because Nepenthes and Tryphiophyllum, this obviously plant here, are believed to share a common ancestor. And exactly the same uses, exactly the same purposes are actually employed for both plants. Most notably in the vines, both plants are used, again, still to this day, for producing ropes and twines, and they produce an incredibly tough cord which can be used. And for this plant, a number of sources, mainly going back to Aries Shore and before, record that this plant's been used for a number of different medicinal properties, curing, again, infections and stomach upsets and so forth. But unfortunately, this plant also has a history of actually killing people. The root extract that was traditionally used, if not treated correctly, was incredibly poisonous. And basically, recent studies have identified the chemicals that have explained this. So the early reports of Aries Shore, he basically went to a place called Bo in Sierra Leone and reported a number of people dying, unfortunately, there because they drank an infusion of Tryphiophyllum root extract. And of course, in North America, prior to European settlement, native North Americans used many different parts of Sarracenia for a number of different purposes, mainly medicinal purposes. And right up until the 19th century, it was still believed that it was a cure for smallpox. That, again, in these carnivorous plants and the habitat books, I've quoted a number of different sources of doctors and different medicinal trials testing this supposed cure for smallpox. To be honest, it really didn't work very well. One in two patients, so 50% of the patients that was tested upon, unfortunately, again, died. Whether that's actually a result of the smallpox itself or the the bad, I guess, compounds in the Saraceni extract really isn't known, but it certainly doesn't seem to be that effective. So I guess, again, there probably was a lot of folklore and tradition. And what's really interesting is Ibicella or Proboscidea, whether or not they're carnivorous, I guess is a bit besides the point, but it's another example of these possible semi-carnivorous plants being used for a number of practical uses. Going back to basketry, the actual fibres of the seed pods themselves, the developing seed pods, were used for making fibres. They actually use the seeds inside the pods, which apparently are edible on their own if you crack them open like nuts. Or if you grind it down, you can make a flour out of it for using for baking. And what's really interesting is that we see an incredible legacy of this. The introduced strains of Proboscidea across the southeastern United States have massive hooks. This is an Ibicella seed pod, and the introduced Proboscidea pods that occur on the plants near to Amerindian settlements or traditional settlements of the Amerindians down in the southern states have gigantic claws, often 3, 4, 5 times as long as this, and much larger seed pods. And it's earnestly believed that this is a direct legacy from centuries or millennia of hybridization by the local Amerindian communities of continually producing pods with larger and larger seed chambers and larger seeds. And as I say, that's kind of a legacy. Although unfortunately most of the Amerindian communities have gone, these plants persist and continue to survive today, close to the traditional homelands of each of these Amerindian groups that used to grow these plants. So for a number of different reasons, for practical, medicinal, or food, these different carnivorous plants were known and used from the 12th century onwards. But the idea of carnivory, the actual use of carnivory, the concept that these plants killed animals, this was an idea that developed much later. Basically, it hinged upon exploration. It hinged upon connecting these ideas, these plants with strange leaves and these animals that appear to be killed and captured by the foliage. It basically hinged on exploration. In colonial times, as explorers started to spread across the world and European colonial powers started to unfurl their empires, really we had a dramatic shift, a huge abrupt increase in the amount of knowledge that started to be related. And when you really step back and try and get your mind into the head of like a 17th or 18th century naturalist and really look at these plants, just step back and think about them, you really do have to ask yourself, why does a plant have a picture, for example, like that? What is it? What is it? I mean, is it a vessel for capturing water or not, or some adaptation for some other purpose? I mean, basically, they are incredibly complex. And as we see in these first accounts, it was completely unexplained. These first explorers and naturalists that started reporting them, from the 17th century onwards, really all of them came back saying that they defied logic and reason, and again, often attributed them to divine powers. Basically, anything that seemed to possess these unusual properties were just basically seen as curiosities and written off without a clear and valid explanation. The Nepenthes of Southeast Asia, particularly the species from Sri Lanka and India that were discovered relatively early on, they were thought to distill water from the air. And I think it was Grimm that actually wrote that they were the work of the divine curator. So basically just a production by God. So because there was no systematic approach to observation in these times, there was no clear process, there was no systematic study of what these organs are, as we have today, really a lot of the details were missed. A lot of the carnivorous plants, which obviously we know today, basically in all the early drawings, which often were relatively simple, they missed out a lot of the details. For example, only in the 18th century, that's 500 years after the first depictions of Drosera, only in the 18th century do we see the first ever depictions of dead animals attached to the leaves. So no one really made the direct connection before the 18th century that these plants kill animals, and that's the reason for them collecting these dead creatures and arthropods. But with the dawn of the scientific rationale of the 17th and 18th centuries, really there became a new generation of naturalists and explorers that would methodically and scientifically question the reason for these plants. Obviously, this really crystallized with the discovery of Sarracenia across North America. And as naturalists increasingly began to move across the southern Gulf coasts, the likes of Mark Catesby in the 1750s, and a few years later, William Bartram, began to do the first methodical observations and relatively detailed drawings. This is actually an illustration by William Bartram, and shows in clear detail a lot of the structures of this is obviously a Sarracenia purpurea plant, and in greater detail than ever before, obviously showing the structure of the venation, the fact that it's colourful, it's not just like a simple green leaf, as many of the earlier explorers had documented, but that it has spectacular coloration and form. And so from this point onwards, these two naturalists in particular really were the first to actually identify this in Sarracenia. From this point onwards, we start to see a much greater awareness of these plants actually killing animals. Catesby himself wrote to say that they seem to serve as an asylum or secure retreat for numerous insects and frogs and other animals which feed on them. Similarly, Bartram, who is, as far as I'm aware, was the very first person to actually suggest that these plants are carnivorous. He suggests that all of the Sarracenias are probably insect catchers, and he made a similar conclusion with Drosera. Now, the point you have to remember is that a suggestion isn't proof. This isn't a validation of this idea, so this is really only tentative theorization. Patrick Collinson, the very famous English horticulturist, basically he was one of the pioneers. He started making very similar, pretty much identical observations from the 1760s onwards in the large numbers of plants that he actually grew in the UK, or back then just in England. He wrote basically many poor insects lose their lives by being drowned in these cisterns of water. And similar observations were making again and again and again with Drosera, Pinguicula, Nepenthes, and other genera. This, as I said, this isn't proof, though. We haven't got yet to a theory. We've got a theory, but we don't have a scientifically validated fact. And basically, that shift from theory to fact really was catalyzed by the discovery of the Venus flytrap. And it's quite easy to imagine how this and why this really had such a dramatic impact. After William Bartram's travels, William Bartram actually drew this, which I believe is the earliest ever drawing of Dionaea. And he returned in the 1760s with this drawing, and later, a few years later, actually collected plants which he distributed across a number of horticulturists across the eastern seaboard of the US, or the American colonies back then, and also across a number of horticulturists in England. It's very easy to see this. I mean, the jaw-like Arthur Dobbs, the governor of California, the governor of the Carolinas, basically described them as a machine to catch food. And it's very easy to imagine how this plant in particular, the dramatic snapping jaws of the Venus flytrap, really caused people, it compelled people to really think again and think seriously that these plants could actually be carnivorous. And I guess, yeah, in fairness, it's not very surprising. It's such a striking plant that can physically move, and it physically looks like a jaw. It's very easy to imagine how that came together. So in 1770, after undertaking a preliminary study of Dionaea, John Ellis wrote to Linnaeus. I believe he wasn't stationed here at the Hortus Botanicus at that point, but obviously it's very interesting to note that this story connects directly to where we're standing and sitting, because obviously a lot of Linnaeus's work was undertaken here. Anyway, John Ellis wrote back to Linnaeus and actually sent him a number of specimens, dried specimens, and detailed descriptions. And basically suggested, he directly wrote in a letter that this plant could be an animal catcher and killer. At the time, again, you've got to get out of the 21st century mindset and think how these would be perceived, these ideas would be perceived in the 18th century. And although it's commonplace and everyday to us, it was revolutionary back then. It was completely against the knowledge that existed at the time. At the time, there was a fixed view of the natural world. The traditional view was God at the top, man, animals, then plants. And this very clear, the very simple structure and hierarchy was rigid. It didn't change. Most authorities believed that no animals or plants could go extinct. It was prohibited by God. And that all plants basically existed on Earth as supplement for food for animals, which existed directly to supplement man. So this was this traditional, very clear pyramidal hierarchy that explained the natural world. And this was the ideas and the beliefs that Linnaeus subscribed to. He was a deeply religious and devout man. And he wrote back to John Ellis, suggesting that the idea of a plant wielding power over an animal was against God's laws. It was blasphemy. His exact words were, it's against the order of nature as willed by God. And he quotes then Genesis in the Bible as evidence of that fact. He wrote again and reiterated that God had designed plants only for sustaining animals and men. So Linnaeus has a unique position in this story. He was well aware that animals were killed, or at least trapped, by plants. After all, he had actually described at least 5 genera of different plants that we now know to be carnivorous. But he made the assumption that all the plants either escape from the traps, or that the traps themselves they serve different purposes. For example, he explained the pitchers of Nepenthes as vessels for containing water. Linnaeus was by far the most respected botanist of the time, and all authorities defaulted to his opinion, by default. Or they developed very similar explanations along similar lines, basically not wanting to question his overwhelming authority. In 1789, Erasmus Darwin, that's the grandfather of Charles Darwin, he basically wrote a poetic work in which he described Dionaea and suggested that the adaptations of the Venus flytrap were a mechanism of self-defense to protect the flowers. He believed that the leaves lay flat on the ground and that there were adaptations to kill any herbivores that came across the ground trying to get at the flower at the middle. The French botanist Auguste, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, he completely dismissed again also the idea of carnivory and suggested that the leaves of Dionaea close only because animals get on here and puncture veins that let out fluid, causing the trap to close, so that it has no at all. And in basically these ideas persisted. But the very first evidence then starts to come along by the late 18th century. A German physician, Roth, he basically did the very first experiments to actually study the reactions of these plants and see if they could actually be adapted to trapping animals. He noticed that if you touch the leaves of Drosera rotundifolia with the hair of a hog, so a hog's bristle, that stimulates the leaves to actually directly move and close. From the 1780s onwards to the 1850s, dozens and dozens and dozens of naturalists and researchers and observers made very similar rudimentary observations, especially with Drosera. To be honest, I could quote 100 of these, but the result is pretty much the same. They all observe that animals are killed by these plants, and there seem to be some deliberate adaptations by the plants, but they don't prove anything. Thomas Knight, for example, felt that the leaves of Drosera close when in direct contact with raw beef. And Benedict also noticed accumulations of prey in Sarracenia and Nepenthes and started to speculate about some of the adaptations that the plants might have to attracting and killing that prey. But all of these theories were either dismissed or didn't really make any progress. By the 19th century, we see another dramatic shift forward. And that happens because the dissemination of knowledge, the process of spreading research and findings, that changed abruptly and quickly. And there's several reasons. There's 4 main reasons for that. Firstly, European naturalists started traveling a lot more from the 19th century onwards. It was more economical, it was cheaper, colonial empires were growing on a massive scale. Every single year, more and more and more naturalists were pouring out of Europe and scouring the world. And that wasn't just limited to colonial explorers and imperial naturalists. It was actually also then starting to become into private hands. And this is a very important shift. When private individuals can start exploring, the amount of knowledge and information that can be discovered and related back, and also not on a colonial agenda, increases hugely and dramatically. Secondly, we have this invention, a very, very simple invention, but one with a profound impact. This is the good old Wardian case. Basically what it is, it's just a simple box, we've all seen them, made out of glass. But this had a dramatic impact And the reason why it had a dramatic impact is because it allowed tropical plants to be transported in a humid environment where they wouldn't dry out and die. They could be carried now from Asia, from Africa, from South America, Australia, anywhere in the world, and they would survive. And that was very important because it allowed a whole new assemblage of living plants to be transported back to Europe to be studied and seen. Thirdly, by the middle of the 19th century, or actually by the 1820s, 1830s, we see a huge shift in capitalism. We see a massive expansion of the middle class. Although it was a time of huge poverty and abject suffering, we nevertheless see a huge and rapid growth of the middle class. And that allowed a new industry, a new plant horticultural industry. Literally the foundations of horticulture today were built in the 1820s and the 1830s because of this growing middle class. And what that allowed was that private individuals could now grow and buy and grow plants at their home. So we see the emergence of a large-scale horticultural industry that persists to this day. Huge botanical gardens start to be built, especially here in Europe. This is one of the glass houses at the Botanical Gardens of Edinburgh. And especially in England, more than any other country, it started to have this romanticized persona, that plant horticulture and tropical plant cultivation was an activity of the upper classes. It was romanticized as the sport of gentlemen. And that made it very attractive to basically this new burgeoning middle class. At that time, again, it was a highly hierarched and structured society. And in order to appear higher up, a lot of the middle classes and lower upper classes started to invest massively in symbols. And symbols were taking place, there was a huge range of symbols, but one of the most powerful and exclusive were large-scale private glass houses. So it really became, what's important, as you can see here, is it really became the activity of gentlemen, and it was done in style. The most exclusive gardens across Europe all then started to have exclusive collections and glass houses of tropical plants that were increasingly imported. And this happened also on a colonial basis as well. From the 1844 to 1848, this gigantic palm house at Kew Gardens was completed. You've got to remember again that initially, we're talking in a time, obviously well before electricity, this thing was powered by oil. I think coal originally, but it then shifted to oil. And it operates still to this very day. This photograph was taken in January. And this is a huge oil burner at Kew that was built 150 years ago to power these huge greenhouses. Again, remember again, get your mind back to these colonial times. This wasn't just a leisurely pursuit. Initially, it wasn't just a leisurely pursuit. It was an instrument of empire. Basically, access to tropical plants basically meant access to trade networks and control. And Kew performed a fundamental role in breaking a number of trade monopolies, most notoriously coffee, spices, rubber. And so initially, it really was a colonial imperial sort of process. But from the 1850s onwards, the role of the botanical gardens shifted increasingly away from industry towards research. And that really gave rise to the growth in botany that basically took place back then. In addition to this academic change, we saw a change in private enterprise. Like I mentioned earlier, this period was the start of the modern horticultural industry that we see today. New nurseries sprung up, again, especially in England, because it was the centre, obviously, of what was the largest empire that ever existed. So British horticulturalists had this niche that they could access these growing colonial empires. And just by coincidence, many of the British territories were the ones that had these huge concentrations of nepenthes and other carnivorous plants. So especially in the UK, we see a rise of massive commercial horticultural nurseries. Most notoriously, this one at the top, Veitch & Sons, or as it's commonly known, Veitch Nurseries. This was the largest nursery at the time, and it specifically employed people to scour the world for new commercial products. Between 1840 and 1905, it employed at least 22 plant hunters to scour the world, to go to countries all over the planet to try and find new and exclusive plants that could be brought back through those Wardian cases and retailed for huge profits. And in many cases, new introductions would go for many times the average wage of a lower class average worker. Again, it's just very interesting to look at the perception of value here. And among those plants that were brought back were gigantic collections of nepenthes. We see, again, especially at Beach Nursery and a couple of others, huge assemblages, again, in these coal-fired power stations, which when you think about it, is just incredible that these things even existed back then. As you can see here, this is actually a view inside Beach's Nursery, as is this one. Unfortunately, the property, the greenhouses have long gone, but these etchings survive today in archives. And again, you've got to think about the time. This was not Europe of today. This was Europe of the mid-19th century. It was a time of extreme poverty and suffering. It was also a climatically very different time. Europe, and again, particularly Britain, was gripped by this so-called Little Ice Age. It's a period of abrupt climatic cooling, just a dip in the cyclic patterns of climate, or the natural cyclic patterns of climate. And for about 50, 60 years, early records show a very, very clear drop in global temperatures, to the extent that the River Thames in London would freeze solid, or the top of it would freeze solid for 2 or 3 feet, to the extent that people would hold these so-called frost fairs, these basically festivals on top of the ice. And this is irrefutably documented, even to the extent, for example, in literature, Charles Dickens documented huge snowfalls in London up to 2 feet tall, which, again, you're lucky to have a dusting in London, a dusting of snow in London today. And so it was a period of much colder temperatures and much, much more extreme poverty. This is an image of basically peasants working in Ireland during the potato famine, in which literally millions starved across the continent of Europe. The last cause in an abrupt change in the dissemination of research and knowledge was basically printing techniques. During the middle of the 19th century, at the heart of industrialization, we see many more innovations in printing technology, which allows printed documents to be produced cheaper, faster, more efficiently, and with a large and growing middle class. Basically, those 3 factors give rise to a hugely expanding spectrum of publications that could be produced. Just to give you a bit of an example of that, in 1838, Richard and Robert Schomburg, actually on this expedition it was only Robert Schomburg, but anyway, went down to the Guiana Highlands in South America. Obviously, he went down to the plateaus, the tepuis, and he actually reached the base of Mount Roraima. He actually proceeded, this is Schomburg here, and he proceeded across this terrain, which, for point of reference, is incredibly accurate. This is exactly how the eastern tepuis look. This diagram is exactly right. He reached what's below the Tawasin Pinnacle, this towering spire of rock on the southeastern flank of Roraima, and down in a little swamp which he called a botanical El Dorado, because there were so many new species, he discovered Helianthora nutans. And this drawing here is the drawing done by Richard Schomburg, standing below this peak, looking up at the colossal, 600-meter tall vertical cliffs of Roraima. So in that setting, at the end of the earth, it had taken him 14 months by that point to reach Roraima, where he was standing. So again, it's not like today where you can just jump on a plane and drive down within about 24 hours. This was 14 months of travel. He discovered Helianthora nutans and produced this illustration. Now, within just 8 years, that had been reproduced at least twice and published in thousands and thousands of copies of work. The 2 publications that these drawings were reproduced in were the type description of nutans. And within just a matter of 8 years, it had been produced and reproduced in thousands of copies in the multiple editions of John Lindley's very successful Vegetable Kingdom. So these different processes gave rise to a huge more awareness of these plants that seemed to catch and kill insects. Ferdinand Bauer found cephalotus in 1802 while on the HMS Investigator. And while actually finding this plant, he immediately suggested that it could be carnivorous and adapted to catching insects. But by this point, by the 1850s, still, these are only theories. There's no proof, there's no evidence to show that these ideas are correct. But again, as is often the case in this story, we see an abrupt shift. And that shift happened when a number of British explorers went to the north of what was then British Borneo, which is today Sabah in Malaysia. And on this enigmatic and spectacular mountain, Mount Kinabalu, the tallest in Borneo, a series of really spectacular nepenthes were discovered. Loea and Raja in 1851, Velosa in 1852, and two more in 1858. What was especially significant was this Nepenthes Raja. It's not only the largest and one of the most spectacular of all Nepenthes known today, but in 1858, Hugh Lowe went back to Mount Kinabalu and took with him Spencer St. John. And in Spencer St. John's account, Gardens of the Sun, he wrote that while wandering in search of flowers, Hugh Lowe discovered in the colossal picture of a Nepenthes Raja plant the body of a drowned rat. And this publication was then printed en masse when Spencer St. John returned to the UK and really captivated botanical imaginations. I guess when you think about a rat being found in these pictures, it forced naturalists to return to this idea that some plants might be carnivorous. There's no more enigmatic an idea, I suppose, than that. Into this concept, into this highly divided highly divided situation of ideas, in 1860, Charles Darwin stepped. Basically, he had been observing Drosera on the moors of Sussex down in the south of England for a number of years. He had written about them in a number of different personal correspondence letters. Obviously, he was well aware of them because his grandfather had written about them and speculated on their purpose. So in 1860, Charles Darwin began what became a 15-year-long study looking at carnivorous plants. This is his home in the south of England, and I strongly recommend if any of you go to London, you visit it because it's absolutely fascinating. It's meticulously restored into the exact condition of what it was basically at the point close to Darwin's death, which was the time pretty much when he was finalizing his theories on carnivorous plants. And inside his greenhouses, Darwin had assembled quite sizable collections of plants that we now know to be carnivorous in order for him to study. He'd collected a number of species of Nepenthes, many Drosera, a number of Pinguicula, Dionea, Sarracenia, Darlingtonia, and I believe also possibly Biblis, but I'm not quite sure off memory with that one. The focus of his work was absolutely on Drosera, even though a number of these have much more striking or obvious adaptations to trap prey, for example, the Venus flytrap. He focused on Drosera because he had an unexhaustible supply of Drosera plants to test and study, basically in the British wetlands. And inside this greenhouse, he undertook a systematic approach, a methodical approach to study the adaptations of these plants. He grew literally hundreds and hundreds of sundews of Drosera to test their adaptations and responses to a number of different chemicals. These are actually some of the experiments that are being reproduced at Down House today. I think they actually used some for urine down there and a number of others, so perhaps not the best, but basically they're recreating Darwin's studies. And as we know, as we're all aware, after a 15-year investigation period, Charles Darwin provided this facet of information, this study that provided for the very, very first time conclusive and direct proof that these plants have specific adaptations to capture and kill animal prey. And an exact parallel to Darwin's studies of evolution. As soon as they came out, it was absolutely ridiculed. The Gardener's Chronicle, this famous British horticultural journal, was full of criticism with Darwin. People were mocking him, ridiculing him. There's even a poem about him saying about how a dog, a pet Fido dog, stepped too close to a daisy and was killed. So basically the theory was highly controversial and exactly like the theory of evolution, it met with fierce opposition and fierce doubt. Again, because these ideas, these traditional religious beliefs were still in play. They were still acting out here. But within a very, very short time, it was immediately apparent, because Darwin's studies were tested again and again and again by naturalists, especially in Germany. And within a very short period of time, it was conclusively identified that this is fact. This isn't fiction or theorization. Darwin's studies were correct, and these plants are carnivorous. And basically, this is the point where we reached. By 1875, we reached the point where we stand today. We know these plants are carnivorous, but we still have very little understanding of the complexity of many of them. This is a plant that's of extreme interest. It's a little plant called Philcoxia that grows in Brazil. There's only 3 species known worldwide. All of them are in Brazil, and all of them occur in a different Brazilian state. And although it was discovered, about 40 years ago, the first species, more recently, a number of observers have identified the fact that the leaves are covered with droplets of glue and may be adapted to catching nematodes up here. Now, although a study was done a few years ago and found no evidence of enzymes, it also found absolutely no evidence in Drosera, in Pinguicula, and a number of other genera. So it really was pretty meaningless. The very first studies are being undertaken by a team in Brazil at the moment, and according to their preliminary studies looking at tracing nitrogen, they support very strongly the idea that these plants are carnivorous. So it just goes to show that even in the 21st century, this is an ongoing story. We reach this conclusion by Darwin that these plants are adapted, but we still have a very long way to go. And in recent years, it really has become apparent that these relationships are much more complex than we've ever imagined, especially in terms of interaction with associated life and in fauna, on which in some cases many of the plants directly depend entirely in order to digest and augment nutrients from their prey. So that's the state where we get to today. We're at a point where we're just beginning to comprehend this incredible diversity of plant life on planet Earth and the adaptations of these carnivorous plants. So I hope you've enjoyed my quick overview of the history of the discovery of carnivorous plants and the revolutionary impact that it had, because obviously after these findings by Darwin were finally published, the whole concept of a plant was completely turned upside down. It had changed from that traditional view as fodder for humans and animals to actively predators. And it was a revolutionary idea that really doesn't get anywhere near enough as attention as it really deserves, because it really did reinvent our understanding of the natural world. So thank you very much indeed, and if I can take any questions, it'd be a pleasure to do so. Any questions at all? Oh, well, thank you very much. If anyone does have any questions, I'm going to be in the orangery for a little bit, and it'll be a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.